Hi, everyone, and welcome to our research webinar, Housing Underproduction in the U.S. My name is Madeline Barron.
And I'm Roderick Hall.
And we work with ECONorthwest, which is an economics consulting firm based out of Portland, Oregon. Our firm has 6 offices across the West Coast, and we work nationwide in these 5 practice areas: planning, development, and transportation, natural resources, education, health, and social policy, business analytics, and economics litigation. I'm a project manager based out of Portland, and I've been working on the Up for Growth research reports for about 4 years.
Like Madeline, I'm also a project manager, though I'm based out of our Los Angeles office. And in addition to being a project manager, I also serve on the board of directors for Up for Growth Action, the 501c4 federal legislative advocacy side to Up for Growth, which is the national cross-sector member network that commissioned our firm for this report.
So our webinar today is going to provide more information on a series of 4 research reports that ECONorthwest and Up for Growth produced. These examine housing underproduction. First, I'll provide some background on where these reports came from, and then I'll step through the report contents and a little bit of the methodology. Then Rod will conclude the webinar with a discussion of the policy implications that have resulted from this discussion on underproduction. So a little bit of background for you. ECONorthwest and Up for Growth produced these 4 research reports evaluating housing underproduction. The first was a nationwide report that came out in April 2018, and it was quickly followed by reports on underproduction in Oregon, California in fall of 2018, and Washington State in early 2020. The reports do 3 things. They calculate underproduction nationally and statewide, and discuss the causes and consequences of underproduction in each state. Secondly, they evaluate 2 different growth scenarios. If we were to build this missing housing over time, what could that growth look like? And importantly, what are the environmental, economic, and fiscal impacts of each growth scenario? And thirdly, they discuss a variety of policy solutions that can help states and local jurisdictions overcome barriers to production and help to increase housing affordability. By way of background, the research behind these reports began in earnest in 2017, when many cities were seeing extremely strong rent and price growth in the housing market, but not a lot of development yet. During this time, the real estate market was still recovering from having been crushed in the Great Recession, and cities were seeing record in-migration, particularly in urban walkable neighborhoods. This slide shows the time it took for construction jobs in blue and total jobs in red in Oregon to hit bottom and recover during the Great Recession. You can see that the construction sector didn't recover all its lost jobs until 50 months after the rest of the economy did. So not only did construction jobs lag the rest of the economy, but the supply of housing lagged the demand for housing for years, while more and more people were moving into certain cities. And when you have a supply and demand imbalance, like many cities saw in that time period, 2016, 2017, 2018, you get very high price and rent growth. You get house flipping and investors joining the market. You get homeowners buying multiple homes and renting them out. And you get an affordability crisis that leads to cost burdening, displacement, and homelessness. This map from the national report shows that the share of households in each county that were cost burdened, meaning that they spent more than 30% of their income on housing. In red counties, more than 40% of households are cost burdened. And in green counties, it's better, but still not great, where less than 20% of households are cost burdened. This map is from 2016, but we know that cost burdening has worsened since then, and it remains to be seen what will happen to households and cost burdening and displacement due to COVID. So it was this environment of strong home price growth and high levels of cost burdening and displacement when these reports sought to shed more light on the issues of underproduction and how underproduction relates to the affordability crisis. So as I said, the reports do 3 different things. The first part focuses on calculating underproduction. And there are many ways to do this, but the simplest theory is to evaluate the ratio of housing units in households. This chart shows that ratio nationally since the 1960s. We can see that since the 60s, the US was producing about 1.1 housing units for every household, or 11 units for 10 households. We need this extra production to account for demolition, second homes, vacancy, and housing falling out of use. However, this ratio has been declining. If we look at the 2010 to 2016 time period, which included the housing bubble leading to the Great Recession, you can see that this ratio dipped below 1, as only 0.98 units per household were produced, or 9.8 units for every 10 households. And that time period includes the early 2000s building boom. So when we look at just the post-recession timeframe, 2010 to 2016, we see that this ratio fell even farther to only 0.72 or 7.2 units for every 10 households. That means there were about 3 new households competing for a unit that wasn't being built. And the Sightline Institute out of Seattle describes this underproduction experience well, kind of calling it a giant game of musical chairs. But instead of removing a chair, you add a household. And instead of being fast, the game is won through a bidding war. It's easy to see how this leads to the cost burdening and price growth we saw in the prior map. The national report found that 23 states underproduced housing during the 2000 to 2015 time period. And you might notice these dates don't line up with the ratios I was just describing, because these findings came from a methodology using each state's housing supply elasticity, which measures how well supply responds to price increases. As I mentioned before, the construction industry lags demand, so housing is considered relatively inelastic and responds slowly to price increases. You can see that the states with the worst underproduction mirror those that saw the most cost burdening in the prior map. The second part of each report steps through 2 growth scenarios if cities and states were to build these missing units. This is where the reports really add a lot of value to the conversation around cost burdening and affordability, and where they also point to policy solutions. The 2 development scenarios evaluated are the more of the same and accessible growth. More of the same adds housing units proportional to an area's existing density. So if a state has 60% of its housing stock as single-family homes, then 60% of the new units, those missing underproduced units, would also be single-family homes. In the accessible growth pattern, we add the densest type of housing to the densest areas first, following a prototype matrix shown here. The accessible growth scenario uses this waterfall approach, the chart in the center, putting the densest housing types in the densest areas. Those areas are selected based on their density, also on their proximity to transit and job centers. New housing is added gradually. It's called gentle density, so that there are no apartment towers next to single-family homes or low-density neighborhoods. Both scenarios build the same number of units, but the types and locations of those units have profound implications that are evaluated in each report. You can see the 3 prototypes in the chart on the left, the single-family home, the podium development, and the towers. And then on the right, you can see how those prototypes are distributed in each of the 2 growth scenarios. In the more of the same, which is just proportional to existing density, you see that 54% of the new produced units, those underproduced missing units, are in single-family homes, and 40% of those units are in podiums, whereas only 6% are in towers. But in the accessible growth development pattern, which focuses on density and transit-oriented areas, only 10% of the new units are in single-family homes, about 60% are in podiums, and almost 30% are in apartment towers. So this does have really big implications that we'll step through in the next few slides. The first thing that the reports look at is the environmental impacts of these different growth patterns. As you can understand, as you can imagine, accessible growth putting housing in dense areas near transit results in better environmental impacts. You're seeing in this chart that in areas near transit centers, houses there already have very low vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. So putting more housing there compared to this more of the same and building more single family homes results in fewer vehicle miles traveled, 66 million fewer vehicle miles traveled over the course of a year, and 1.8 million fewer cars on the road. This is important for climate change and cities that are aiming to reduce their environmental impact. In addition, the report looks at economic impacts of the different growth patterns. Building these missing units would generate significant spending, which ripples through the economy. Because the 2 different growth scenarios build the same number of units, the overall impacts are not terribly different. But because accessible growth builds denser units in towers and podiums, which are higher value and cost more to build, they do have higher spending rippling through the economy. One of the ways this report advances the conversation is that it's one of the first of its kind to use REMI to estimate changes to the economy that would result from this big increase in development spending. REMI is an economic input-output modeling software. It's dynamic, so it takes into consideration changes in demand patterns, changes in commuting patterns, and overall changes to an economy. REMI has a baseline forecast, and then once you include the inputs to the policy change, it calculates the deviation from that forecast, and that is your economic impact. The model includes inputs for hard and soft construction costs for those 3 prototypes we showed, and also includes infrastructure spending via systems development charges that are calculated across all the different states. And then lastly, the report steps through the fiscal impacts of these different growth patterns. As we said, different prototypes generate different property tax revenues. They have different values and construction types. In addition, system development charges or impact fees are often charged on a per unit basis. So denser developments would generate more system development charges and more fiscal revenues for local governments. But interestingly, denser developments require less infrastructure, as anyone who's done infill knows. You might need to upgrade your sewer or your electrical, but the roads are already there, the infrastructure systems are already there, the installation is there, just needs to be upgraded. And that compares pretty significantly to a single family home that might be built in a greenfield development, where new roads, new sewers, new electric all need to be put in place, installed to get to that single family home, just to get to one unit. So accessible growth by building more housing units and denser housing units provides greater fiscal impacts for local governments. Number 1, it generates higher value units, which generates more taxes. Number 2, the denser units generate more development charges. And number 3, the denser units cost less in ongoing infrastructure spending, particularly ongoing operations and maintenance. And then the third section of the report focuses on policy solutions. The report highlights these different opportunities for local jurisdictions and states to overcome barriers to production. Zoning reform by allowing denser developments, by increasing the allowable types, by focusing development near jobs and transit, and doing things that make development easier and more feasible, like reducing parking requirements. It also considers system development reforms, impact fee reforms that would avoid the disincentivization, as I mentioned on the prior slide. It also suggests expanded programs and funding to support low income and mixed income development in mixed income communities, and policy reforms that would increase the certainty and reduce the risk in development processes. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rod to talk about the policy implications that resulted from this report.
Thank you so much, Madeline, for giving us an overview of the report itself in terms of the outline, as well as diving more specifically into the scenarios and what they meant, both or what they mean from an economic, fiscal, and environmental standpoint. And then, of course, ending it with solutions that can help us figure out how do we work towards achieving accessible growth at the local level. I think that's very important. As Madeline mentioned, I'm going to talk about the implications. And I think, not only are reports like the underproduction in the US and the state-specific reports that accompany this first iteration, not only are they fun to produce, but the implications of reports like this can also contribute immensely to how we frame the conversation regarding housing underproduction, the housing shortage. And one of the things that has been great about this report that we're already seeing is that a lot of the examples of solutions that Madeline discussed are at the local level. And we know that it's very important for local communities to have a say-so, but we also know that there are a lot of local communities that are not able to do what they need to do, or they're not doing it because they do not want to do it, who are also a part of the solutions. And so this report has 2 major takeaways, which is the first in terms of impact is that it put a number to underproduction for the nation as a whole, as well as specific states such as California, Oregon, and Washington. And by doing so, this report has driven the narrative that the US has a national housing shortage and elevated the conversation regarding solutions, not just elevated it from being just locally focused and now being about how can states and the federal government get involved to helping us figure out how to achieve accessible growth. We see that in the legislation side at the federal level, we have bills such as the Yes in My Backyard Act, the Build More Housing Near Transit Act, and the Housing Supply and Affordability Act. Most recently, actually, the Housing Supply and Affordability Act was included in its own way into the budget reconciliation package. And for those who are not aware, this bill proposes the creation of a new local housing policy grant program that would provide critical resources to cities and states alike to develop housing needs assessments and action plans to remove barriers, boost housing production, and get us on a path towards accessible growth. But at the same time, it's not just the federal level. Again, this conversation has also been elevated to the state level. We see that in California with AB 2345, which looked to enhance California's statewide density bonus. We see it in Oregon with HB 2001, which legalized missing middle housing fourplexes across the state. And then we see it in Washington State with HB 1220. And it's really important that we see this conversation happening at these higher levels of government, not only from the standpoint of providing resources, which is what the Housing Supply and Affordability Act seeks to do, but also by making it so that there's more tangible policy, like enhancing the density bonus so that we can build more podiums or towers in our communities around the states that we live in and around the nation to ultimately address the housing shortage and affordability crisis. Now that we have all this information, you're probably wondering, what does this mean at like the local level, at the city level? And it's important to note that all cities, regardless of the classifications that they fall into, whether it's an expensive city, which is going to have to start thinking about how to get denser to address this, or whether it's an expansive city where they're starting to grow out and you could see sprawl or other negative implications to the environment or to social determinants of health, or legacy cities that in some cases may be looking to revitalize themselves altogether and spur new economic development and thus spurring new people moving into the community. Regardless of where a community falls, and it's important to note that some of these communities may have shifted, as this graph is from 1980 to 2010 and we're now in 2021. The point still remains that the solutions, not only that Madeline mentioned at the local level, but also the ways in which state governments and the federal government are putting forth legislation, are all important to helping communities address the housing shortage crisis and the affordability crisis, and actually thinking through how we can meet people where they're at. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to apply these policies the same, but it is important for them to have kind of a toolkit of a variety of resources, given that they're all in different places. So based on that, what comes next are a few things. The first is that we know that after doing this report, underproduction is still an issue. This report didn't solve it. It shed light on it, right? By putting a number to underproduction, and by reshaping the conversation, we can now understand that it's still an issue, but we now also have a framework for how to begin discussing it. And then in the next iteration, as we continue to do more and more of this research around underproduction, we want to begin to have a larger focus on equity impacts and what does it mean to think about federally protected groups, or in the cases of some states that have even more protected classes than the federal level, such as the state of California. What does it mean in any of these states to kind of address or think about how the solutions we're talking about work for all communities, regardless of their socioeconomic background or their race or any other identity. And then, of course, because of these conversations we've been having, we know that there's substantial interest in the topic. We see people not only inquiring more about the different aspects, such as the economy or fiscally or environmentally or from an equitable standpoint, the subtopics, but even more broadly or at a higher level than the subtopics, there's just this huge amount of interest in understanding underproduction and how it has contributed to the crisis that we're all trying to address. As a result of this interest, we will begin to move to a point where this is a recurring annual report that seeks to update itself year after year, so that we're ensuring that we are aware and staying as much as possible up to date and operating in real time with our understanding of what's working, what's not working, how is that helping us move forward towards accessible growth, and what does this mean for the crisis as a whole. And then last, but certainly not least, this is probably the most important point, is that this report is a communication tool. And we want to make sure people understand that and can use that however they need to in their communities as housing change makers and as people who seek to address, this very complex problem. When we've already seen the benefits of using this as a communication tool due to the fact that we have gotten bills in Congress, we've gotten these bills passed at the state level, and we're starting to see a lot of traction and people understanding and getting on the same page with like how many homes need to be produced, who they should be affordable to, et cetera, et cetera. And so none of that would have been possible without this report and without us setting the stage. So please look forward to getting the reports. The information for the reports that we've already done will be included in this webinar. And then as we move forward, please follow us, stay up to date with the new iterations of the report. And on behalf of myself, Madeline, ECONorthwest, and Up for Growth, we want to thank you for attending the webinar.
Thanks.